Did you know that during World War II, if a soldier was wounded and made it to a doctor, he had a greater than 90% chance of survival? That's a staggering number. It was a huge leap from the war before it. Like, this wasn't an accident, it was the result of a hidden war, a second battle fought not with guns, but with plasma scalpels and sheer nerve. This battle was waged in muddy trenches, in crowded tents that served as operating rooms, and in the skies over enemy territory. The soldiers in this war wore a red cross on their helmets, or a caduceus on their collars. They were medics, nurses, surgeons, dentists, psychiatrists, and scientists. Most of their names are lost to history. They didn't lead charges or capture headlines. They simply saved lives one by one under impossible conditions. Who were these people? What drove a man to run toward gunfire, armed only with a medical kit? How did a nurse from a quiet town find the strength to hold a dying man's hand while bombs fell around them? What secret innovations in a laboratory in Illinois or a blood bank in New York City turned the tide against death itself? We remember the generals and the battles. We study the maps and the strategies. But what about the strategy to cheat death? This is the story of that other war. It's the story of 19 people, and through them, the story of hundreds of thousands more who fought to mend what the war had broken. Number 5. What if the most important battle was fought in the first 10 minutes? The first moments after a soldier is hit are a chaotic blur. There's the shock, the pain, the confusion. In that chaos, one person becomes the most important figure in the world, the medic. He was often just a kid himself, maybe 19 or 20 years old. He had a few weeks of specialized training, a canvas bag full of bandages and sulfa powder, and a heavy responsibility. His job was to get to the wounded, stop the bleeding, and keep them alive long enough to get them to the next stage of care. The enemy knew how vital the medic was. The red cross on his helmet was supposed to be a symbol of neutrality under the Geneva Convention. In reality, it often made him a target. Medics suffered a casualty rate far higher than the average infantryman. They ran into the very danger everyone else was trying to escape. One of the most well-known medics of the war was Desmond. His story is unique because he was a conscientious objector. He refused to carry a weapon due to his religious beliefs. Serving with the 77th Infantry Division in the Pacific, he faced ridicule from his fellow soldiers. They couldn't understand a man who would go to war but not fight. They saw him as a coward. That changed during the brutal battle for Okinawa in the spring of 1945. His unit was ordered to take a sheer cliff face called the Maeda Escarpment. The fighting was savage. The Americans took the top, but a fierce counterattack drove them back, leaving dozens of wounded men scattered across the clifftop, exposed to enemy fire. Doss refused to retreat. For hours, all alone, he scrambled from one wounded man to the next. He treated their injuries, and then, one by one, he dragged them to the edge of the cliff and lowered them down to safety using a rope. He worked under constant fire, praying after each rescue, "Lord, please help me get one more." By the time he was done, he had saved an estimated 75 men. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions, the only conscientious objector to receive it during the war. His story, told in the book The Unlikeliest Hero by Bhutan Herndon, shows a different kind of courage. It wasn't the courage to take a life, but the unshakable commitment to save one. But Doss wasn't the only one. There were thousands like him. Consider Harold A. Garman, a private first class serving as a medic in France. In August 1944, his platoon was ambushed. They were pinned down by intense machine gun fire. Men were falling all around him. Garman left his covered position without a second thought. He ran out into the open, into the direct line of fire, to reach a severely wounded officer. He administered first aid and then carried the officer back to safety. Then he did it again. He went back out into the bullet-swept field for another wounded soldier. He was hit and wounded himself, but he kept going, treating others and refusing evacuation until he was sure everyone else had been cared for. His Medal of Honor citation reads like something out of a movie, but it was real. Then there was Robert D. Maxwell. During the fighting in southern France in September 1944, he was part of a small group of soldiers who found themselves surrounded. They took cover in a house, but the enemy was closing in. An enemy grenade landed in the room where Maxwell and several others were huddled. There was no time to think. Maxwell, a technician 5th grade who was part of the service company but acting as a medic, threw himself onto the grenade. He used his body and his medical kit to absorb the blast, The explosion mangled his body, but he saved the lives of his comrades. He survived his injuries and was also awarded the Medal of Honor. These men represent the thousands of company aid men, the first link in the chain of evacuation. Their tools were simple morphine syrettes to dull the pain, battle dressings to stop the bleeding, and sulfa powder, a new miracle drug at the time, to prevent infection in the wound. As documented in the Medical Department Medical Service in the European Theater of Operations by Graham Akosmas and Albert E. Cowdray, the effectiveness of these frontline medics was a game changer. They stabilized soldiers who, in previous wars, would have died on the battlefield before anyone could reach them. They were the first and most critical step in that 90% survival rate. The front line wasn't just in Europe. In the jungles of Burma and New Guinea, medics faced different challenges. There, the enemy wasn't just bullets and shrapnel. It was malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, and a host of other tropical diseases. A medic had to be a public health expert too. He handed out Aterine tablets for malaria prevention and enforced sanitation rules. He dealt with snake bites and fungal infections. The medic was the first line of defense against both the enemy and the environment. The story of the Japanese-American medics of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team is particularly poignant. These men, like James Kokubo, served with incredible distinction in Europe while their own families were held in internment camps back in the United States. Okubo, a technician 5th grade, repeatedly exposed himself to fire in the forests of France in October 1944. For 3 days, he crawled through minefields and under direct machine gun and mortar fire to treat and evacuate 17 of his fellow soldiers. He even ran through a hail of bullets to man a machine gun when its crew was hit, covering fire so other medics could get to the wounded. His actions were so heroic that his commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor, but at the time, he was only awarded a Silver Star. It took more than 50 years after a review of discrimination in past awards for him to be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in 2000. His story is a powerful reminder of the dedication these men had, saving the lives of soldiers in an army that still viewed them and their families with suspicion. These medics were the unsung heroes who made everything else possible. Without their courage, the most brilliant surgeon or the most advanced hospital would be useless. They were the ones who turned a dying soldier into a patient. They were the ones who started the clock on a man's second chance at life. Yet, for all we know about their bravery, so much is still a mystery. How did these young men, with minimal training, cope with the psychological trauma of seeing such horrific injuries day after day? What was the long-term mental health cost for the healers who lived on the edge of death? And in the chaos of battle, how many medics made impossible choices, deciding who to save and who was beyond help, and how did they live with those choices for the rest of their lives? Number 4, can you really perform brain surgery in a tent? Once a medic got a wounded soldier off the battlefield, the race against time had only just begun. The next stop was a forward aid station, and then, if the injury was serious, a field hospital. This is where the surgeons took over. The image of a clean, sterile operating room was a world away. These were doctors working in canvas tents, abandoned buildings, or sometimes just in the back of a truck. They operated by the light of gasoline lanterns while artillery shells shook the ground. They fought mud, dust, infection, and exhaustion. The medical advancements of the war weren't just about new drugs. They were about a whole new philosophy of care. The key was bringing the surgeon closer to the front. A pivotal figure in this revolution was Dr. Michael DeBakey. Before he became a world-famous heart surgeon, he was a young doctor who served in the Surgeon General's office. In 1942, he and his colleagues studied medical reports and realized that too many soldiers were dying of shock and infection before they could get to a proper hospital. The old system, which involved transporting the seriously wounded far to the rear, wasn't working. DeBakey's work was instrumental in developing the concept of mobile army surgical hospitals, or MASH units, which became famous in the Korean War but had their roots in World War II. These were small, mobile units that could be set up just a few miles behind the front lines. They could perform life-saving surgery within hours, sometimes even minutes, of a soldier being wounded. This concept, outlined in studies from the U.S. Army Medical Department's Office of Medical History, drastically reduced the time between injury and operation. Another key advocate for forward surgery was Dr. Howard Snyder, who served as the chief surgical consultant for the American forces in Europe. He was a close friend of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he used that connection to push for radical changes. Snyder insisted on using whole blood for transfusions right at the front instead of just plasma. He understood that a soldier bleeding out needed red blood cells to carry oxygen, not just fluid to maintain blood pressure. He also championed the idea of specialized teams for different types of injuries. For example, neurosurgical teams were brought forward to treat head wounds, which previously had an almost 100% mortality rate if operated on in the rear. Now, a soldier with a severe head injury could be under the knife of a specialist within hours. It was a brutal but effective form of triage. The surgeons themselves were a special breed. They worked punishing hours. Dr. Edward D. Churchill, a Harvard professor who served as a surgical consultant, described shifts that could last for 36 or even 48 hours straight during a major offensive. In his book, Surgeon to Soldiers, he wrote about the sheer volume of casualties after events like the D-Day landings. The surgeons and their teams would work until they literally dropped from exhaustion, only to be woken up a few hours later to start all over again. They became incredibly fast and efficient, developing new techniques on the fly. They practiced debridement, the aggressive cutting away of dead and damaged tissue around a wound to prevent gas gangrene, a deadly infection that had plagued armies for centuries. And it wasn't just the famous surgeons. An often overlooked group were the dentists. The Army Dental Corps did more than just fill cavities. Many dentists were trained as maxillofacial surgeons, specialists in rebuilding faces. In a war of explosions and shrapnel, devastating facial injuries were common. And men arrived with jaws shattered, noses gone, faces torn apart. Dentists like Brigadier General Lee C. Fairbank were instrumental in establishing forward-thinking treatment centers. They used innovative techniques, taking bone from a hip to reconstruct a jaw, or skin from a thigh to rebuild a cheek. They weren't just saving a life, they were giving a man back his identity. Their work was a precursor to modern plastic and reconstructive surgery. The conditions were primitive, sterilization was a constant struggle, instruments were boiled on gasoline stoves. Surgeons wore rubber boots because the floors, often just dirt or wood planks, were slick with blood. But they adapted, they used what they had. A 1945 report from the Bulletin of the U.S. Army Medical Department details how surgical teams would use local resources, setting up in a French farmhouse or an Italian schoolhouse, turning everyday spaces into life-saving theaters. One of the less-known female surgeons who broke barriers was Dr. Dita McCarthy. At a time when women doctors were rarely allowed near combat zones, she served with the 2nd Evacuation Hospital in the European theater. She was an anesthesiologist, a critical member of any surgical team. Her job was to keep patients alive and unconscious on the operating table, a monumental task when you're dealing with men in deep shock from blood loss. Her presence and expertise in a field dominated by men proved that skill, not gender, was what mattered when a life was on the line. The work in these forward surgical units was a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. They proved that with the right people and the right mindset, you could perform complex, life-saving surgery in the worst conditions imaginable. They were the bridge between the chaos of the battlefield and the safety of a real hospital. But so many questions remain. How did these surgeons, trained in pristine city hospitals, adapt so quickly to the horrors and limitations of combat surgery? What were the long-term effects on the doctors and nurses who were so intimately involved in the carnage of war, day in and day out? And for all the lives they saved, how many experimental procedures failed? And are those stories lost to history forever? Number 3, what happens when the wounds are invisible? The war didn't just break bodies, it broke minds. For every soldier with a shrapnel wound, there was another with an injury you couldn't see. They called it shell shock in the First War. In the Second, it was known as combat fatigue, battle exhaustion, or war neurosis. Today, we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But in the early 1940s, it was a poorly understood condition. Many officers in the chain of command saw it as a sign of weakness, cowardice, or a lack of moral fiber. A soldier who broke down mentally was often seen as a failure, but a few forward-thinking doctors in the medical corps knew better. They knew this was a legitimate wound of war, and they fought to get it treated as such. The scale of the problem was enormous. During the war, psychiatric casualties became the single largest category of medical disability. According to U.S. Army statistics, more men were discharged for psychiatric reasons than for any other medical cause. In some campaigns, like the protracted and bitter fighting in Italy, the number of psychiatric casualties threatened to overwhelm the medical system and undermine the Army's combat effectiveness. The Army was forced to confront a problem it didn't want to admit it had. A central figure in this fight was a psychiatrist from Kansas named Dr. William C. Menninger. Along with his brother Karl, he had founded the famous Menninger Clinic. When the war started, he was commissioned as a colonel and became the director of the Psychiatry Consultants Division for the Surgeon General. He was shocked by what he found. The army had no real system for dealing with psychiatric problems. Screening of draftees was poor, and treatment for soldiers who broke down was almost non-existent. They were often just shipped home, branded as unfit. Menninger revolutionized the army's approach to mental health. His work is detailed in the book Psychiatry in a Troubled World, which compiled his wartime papers. He argued for a new principle he called PI proximity, immediacy, and expectancy. This meant treating soldiers with combat fatigue as close to the front lines as possible, proximity, and as quickly as possible, immediacy. The third part, expectancy, was crucial. Soldiers were treated with the clear expectation that they would recover and return to their units. This was a radical departure from the old way of thinking. It framed combat fatigue not as a permanent failure, but as a temporary and treatable wound. Under this new system, a soldier showing signs of extreme stress, uncontrollable shaking, muteness, paralysis, or severe anxiety would be sent to a forward exhaustion center just behind the lines. There, he would be given a chance to rest, get a hot meal, sleep for 24 to 48 hours, often with the help of sedatives, and talk to a psychiatrist or a therapist. The goal was to remove him from the immediate trauma, but keep him close to his unit, his source of social support. The results were remarkable. Under this forward treatment model, between 60 and 80% of soldiers with combat fatigue were able to return to duty within a few days. Other psychiatrists did crucial work in the field. Dr. Roy Grinker and Dr. John Spiegel were two Air Force flight surgeons who studied the intense stress faced by bomber crews. Flying mission after mission over enemy territory, seeing friends' planes explode in midair, and dealing with the constant threat of death took a massive toll. Grinker and Spiegel's 1945 book, Men Under Stress, became a foundational text in the study of trauma. They conducted interviews with airmen and used therapy, sometimes aided by drugs like sodium pentothal, a truth serum, to help them process their traumatic experiences. They documented the nightmares, the anxiety, the depression, and the physical symptoms that came with the psychological wounds of combat. This new focus on mental health wasn't just about treatment, it was also about prevention. Psychiatrists worked with commanders to improve leadership, to ensure soldiers got enough rest, and to rotate units out of the line before they reached their breaking point. They helped develop screening tests to identify recruits who might be more susceptible to breaking down under stress. It was the beginning of a systematic scientific approach to the psychology of warfare. Ansel Keys, a physiologist from the University of Minnesota, also made an unexpected contribution to troop morale and mental well-being. He was tasked with developing a stable, non-perishable ration for soldiers in the field. The result was the K-ration, a small box containing a mix of biscuits, a canned meat product, a chocolate bar, and coffee powder. While not exactly gourmet, it provided a reliable source of calories and a small comfort from home. For a soldier exhausted and far from home, a simple, familiar thing like a chocolate bar could be a powerful psychological boost. It was a small but significant factor in maintaining mental resilience. The battle for the mind was perhaps the most unsung part of the medical corps' work. It was a fight against an invisible enemy, waged not with bandages and sulfa, but with compassion, understanding, and a new science of the human mind under pressure. These doctors saved thousands of men from a lifetime of mental anguish and disability. They forced the military and society as a whole to start seeing mental wounds as real wounds. But even with their progress, fundamental questions haunted their work. What was the line between genuine combat fatigue and a lack of will to fight? And who had the right to draw that line? How many soldiers were misdiagnosed and punished for what was a legitimate medical condition? And as these men returned home, what long-term support was available for the invisible scars that would affect them, their families, and their communities for decades to come? Number 2, who were the angels in the sky and the prisoners on the ground? The story of the medical corps is overwhelmingly a story about men, but tens of thousands of women served as nurses, and their contributions were just as vital and their bravery just as real. They worked in field hospitals and evacuation hospitals, often just miles from the fighting. They were on hospital ships that were targeted by enemy submarines and planes. And they served in one of the most innovative and dangerous new roles of the war. As flight nurses, they were the ones who brought a new level of care to the wounded, often in the face of prejudice and in conditions that tested the limits of their endurance. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps grew from less than 1,000 members before the war to over 59,000 by 1945. They served in every theater of the war, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific. One of the most harrowing stories is that of the Angles of Bataan and Corregidor. These were Army and Navy nurses stationed in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded in late 1941. As American and Filipino forces were pushed back onto the Bataan Peninsula, the nurses set up makeshift hospitals in the jungle. They cared for thousands of wounded and dying men while battling malaria, dysentery, and near starvation themselves. When Bataan fell in April 1942, and then the island of Corregidor a month later, these nurses were captured. Led by their chief nurse, Captain Maud C. Davison, they spent the next 3 years, over 1,000 days, as prisoners of war. Interned at the Santo Tomas camp in Manila, they endured horrific conditions. They suffered from malnutrition and disease, but they never stopped being nurses. They set up a camp hospital and continued to care for their fellow prisoners, working with smuggled medical supplies and their own ingenuity. Their story of survival and unwavering dedication is documented in books like We Band of Angels by Elizabeth M. Norman. When they were finally liberated in February 1945, they were weak and emaciated, but they had survived together, a testament to their incredible resilience and professional commitment. While the Angles of Bataan were fighting for survival on the ground, another group of nurses was pioneering a new field in the air. The development of long-range transport planes like the C-47 made it possible to evacuate wounded soldiers by air, a much faster and smoother journey than by ship or ambulance. But these planes weren't flying hospitals. They were cold, loud, unpressurized cargo planes. A new type of nurse was needed, one who could care for critically injured men at 10,000 feet, often without a doctor present. This was the birth of the flight nurse. The first woman to be awarded the Air Medal was a flight nurse, Second Lieutenant LCSI. In January 1943, she was assigned to a flight from India to Washington, D.C., a trip that took a week. It was the first ever intercontinental air evacuation flight. She had no previous experience as a flight nurse. The specialty didn't even exist yet. She was responsible for 5 seriously ill patients. Over the course of the long journey, she managed their care, changed their dressings, and kept them alive. Her successful mission proved that transoceanic air evacuation was possible and led to the creation of the U.S. Army Air Force's School of Air Evacuation. Well, thousands of nurses would follow in her footsteps. These flight nurses had to be tough. They went through rigorous training, including survival skills in case their plane was shot down behind enemy lines. They learned how altitude affects different medical conditions. They learned how to load and unload stretchers from awkward cargo doors. On a single flight, a nurse and her medical technician might be responsible for 20 to 30 seriously wounded men. They were in the air for hours, sometimes flying over combat zones. They were true pioneers of aerospace medicine. The work of women in the medical corps wasn't limited to nursing. Women also served as physical therapists, at the time called reconstruction aides. A key figure in this field was Emma E. Vogel. She was the director of physical therapists for the Army Medical Department. She recruited and trained hundreds of women to work in Army hospitals, helping soldiers recover from amputations, severe fractures, and nerve damage. This was grueling, long-term work. It was about more than just healing a wound. It was about rebuilding a life. They taught men with new prosthetic limbs how to walk again. They used exercise and massage to restore function to shattered bodies. Their work was essential in ensuring that a soldier's survival on the battlefield was followed by a meaningful recovery at home. These women, whether they were prisoners of war, pioneers in the sky, or therapists in a recovery ward, fundamentally changed the nature of military medicine. They brought a level of professional care and compassion that was indispensable. They proved their courage and competence under the most extreme circumstances, paving the way for future generations of women in the military. And yet their stories are often relegated to the footnotes of history. How many other women performed acts of quiet heroism that were never recorded? How did these nurses and therapists cope with the social and professional barriers they faced in a male-dominated military? And when they returned home, were their contributions and their trauma recognized in the same way as the male soldiers they had cared for? Number 1 was the war one in a laboratory. The heroes of the medical corps weren't all on the front lines. Some of the most important battles were fought in laboratories and research centers far from the sound of guns. The war spurred a period of intense medical innovation. Scientists, doctors, and technicians worked around the clock to solve problems that had plagued armies for centuries: shock, infection, and disease. Their breakthroughs saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives. Three of the most important developments were blood banking, the mass production of penicillin, and the development of new vaccines. The problem of blood loss was a major killer. A soldier could bleed to death in minutes. While blood transfusions were possible, storing and transporting whole blood was incredibly difficult. The solution that emerged was blood plasma. Plasma is the liquid part of blood, and it can be dried into a powder, shipped anywhere in the world, and then reconstituted with sterile water right on the battlefield. It was a lifesaver for treating shock, the deadly drop in blood pressure that follows severe injury. The man most associated with developing the system for this is Dr. Charles R. Drew. Dr. Drew was a brilliant African-American surgeon. In 1940, he was tapped to lead the Blood for Britain project, an effort to collect and ship plasma to the United Kingdom, which was then under heavy air attack. He developed efficient methods for extracting, processing, and storing large quantities of plasma. His work was so successful that he was appointed the director of the first American Red Cross blood bank. However, Drew faced the bitter irony of racial segregation. The military at the time insisted that the blood of white and black donors be kept separate. Drew knew there was no scientific basis for this and protested the policy as unscientific and insulting. He resigned from his position in 1942 in protest. Despite this injustice, the system he created became the model for a massive national blood drive that saved countless soldiers of all races. His scientific contribution was monumental, even as he fought against the prejudice of his own country. The second miracle was penicillin. The antibiotic properties of the penicillium mold had been discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, but producing it in large enough quantities for medical use seemed impossible. The war made it a top priority. Bacterial infections, especially in deep, dirty wounds, were a major cause of death and amputation. A breakthrough came from a team at Oxford University led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, but it was in the United States that mass production became a reality. The U.S. government declared penicillin a critical war material. The unsung hero here is Andrew J. Moyer, a microbiologist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's research lab in Peoria, Illinois. His job was to figure out how to grow the mold more efficiently. Through trial and error, he discovered that adding corn steep liquor, a byproduct of processing corn, and lactose to the fermentation broth increased the yield of penicillin tenfold. He also found a more productive strain of the mold on a cantaloupe from a local market. These seemingly small discoveries were the key to industrial-scale production. By 1944, pharmaceutical companies were producing enough penicillin to treat every soldier who needed it. It was incredibly effective against gas gangrene, pneumonia, and other infections. Doctors called it a miracle drug. It transformed surgery and wound care. The third front in this scientific war was against infectious diseases. When you send millions of soldiers to tropical locations around the globe, you expose them to diseases their bodies have never encountered. In the Pacific, diseases like malaria, dengue fever, and Japanese encephalitis were as dangerous as the enemy. Public health experts became vital members of the military team. Dr. Fred Soper of the Rockefeller Foundation was a legendary disease hunter who was loaned to the military to help control malaria in the Pacific. He pioneered aggressive mosquito control techniques, including the widespread use of the new insecticide DDT. While the long-term environmental effects of DDT were later understood to be devastating, at the time it was seen as a weapon that could wipe out the mosquitoes that carried a deadly disease. Another key figure was a virologist named Dr. Albert Sabin. He is famous today for developing the oral polio vaccine, but during the war he was an Army major tasked with protecting troops from tropical diseases. He developed effective vaccines against Japanese encephalitis and dengue fever, two viral diseases that were disabling thousands of soldiers. His work required him to travel to dangerous areas to collect samples and test his vaccines, often on himself and other volunteers. This work in military virology was a critical part of the war effort, protecting the health and fighting strength of the troops. These scientists and researchers were the invisible lifeline of the medical corps. Their work armed the frontline medic and the forward surgeon with tools that were more powerful than any weapon. The plasma that stopped a soldier from going into shock, the penicillin that prevented a wound from becoming fatal, the vaccine that stopped an epidemic before it could start, these were the products of a different kind of heroism. It was the heroism of patience, intellect, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge in the service of saving lives. But their triumphs also raised difficult questions. In the desperate race to find cures and treatments, what ethical lines were crossed in human experimentation? How much did wartime secrecy slow down the sharing of life-saving information with civilian populations? And as we rely more and more on technology in medicine today, have we forgotten the simple, human-centered lessons learned in the laboratories and clinics of that great and terrible war?